Okay, so the last time that we were here, we were talking about some of the early attempts to teach apes and other primates to learn language. And I closed with the case of Winthrop Kellogg raising the chimpanzee Gua alongside his son Donald. So now let's talk about a few other attempts that people have done to teach apes language. So in general, it is probably never going to be the case that an ape or any type of non-human primate is going to be able to speak the way that you and I do. Our human vocal apparatus specifically has involved adaptations to enable speech. Apes and other non-human primates do not have the same vocal apparatus as we do. As a result, they're not going to be able to speak the way that you or I can. But other people have tried teaching chimps and other primates to use things like American Sign Language. You might be very familiar with cases such as Koko the gorilla. Other researchers have studied the chimp Washoe, and also Nim Chimpsky. Nim Chimpsky ultimately learned over 100 different signs for words, but couldn't use this language productively. There was not necessarily building of signs on one another. There was not proper use of syntax, and similar things have been found with Koko the gorilla as well as Washoe. These early attempts to teach language, either by raising apes as humans or teaching them sign language, hasn't really worked well. Probably the closest example that we have is the case of Kanzi. Kanzi is a bonobo. This is an early picture of Kanzi. Kanzi ultimately studied an artificial language that was made up of a lexigram. So a lexigram is kind of a pictorial representation of a word, sort of like hieroglyphics are in ancient Egypt, where you're presented with a picture and this picture represents the whole word. And a lot of what Kanzi learned is through observation and through interacting with the researchers. And what they have basically found, if you go to where Kanzi is studied up in Iowa, he has a big computerized wall of different lexicograms. And each of these lexicograms, when Kanzi presses a button, is associated with a word. So Kanzi is able to associate that lexigram with a certain sound. And it's been estimated that he is equivalent to a 2 or 3-year-old in terms of comprehension. But that is probably the best it is going to get. Now, what makes us particularly special is that in terms of biology, I don't know why my head is moving around so much. I'm just trying to get it out of the way. Our brain has evolved to learn language. So we have specific areas of the brain. So I know that you can't see the labels here, but here we're focusing on the left hemisphere because the left hemisphere of the brain is kind of critical for language. What you're looking at here is an area called Broca's area. This is an area called the left inferior frontal gyrus. Now, here's what's kind of critical. This is the motor cortex of the frontal lobe, and this area of Broca's area is directly underneath the motor cortex. And it turns out that Broca's area is really critical for producing the movements necessary to make speech. If Broca's area is damaged, you can understand speech, but you cannot speak it. So you would have what is called non-fluent aphasia. Now, aphasia in general means a disruption of language. Aphasia literally translates to cannot speak. Broca's area produces a non-fluent aphasia. That means that you are not able to produce speech easily. Now, if we focus over here in the temporal lobe, right here is our primary auditory cortex, and this is an area near the superior temporal gyrus, so the upper portion of the temporal lobe. This area is called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is an area that is critical for speech comprehension. And so if this area is damaged, you will get what is called a fluent aphasia. That means that you can produce speech, but it's probably not going to make a whole lot of sense to you. Now, another thing that we know about the biology of language is that children and infants are capable of learning language very well without a lot of significant instruction. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how language develops in infancy and in childhood. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about language learning in children is that you will find very similar patterns across a variety of languages, despite the fact that the languages are different. So at birth, vocalization is largely going to be an ah sound, and there are going to be a lot of guttural cries. The larynx the vocal apparatus hasn't dropped yet, so a lot of the crying that you're going to hear is very animal-like in its sound. So I'm going to try to demonstrate for you. It's going to sound like ah, ah, ah. So you can kind of see that the vocal apparatus hasn't really dropped yet to produce additional speech sounds beyond that. By about the age of 6 months, babies are going to engage in a process that is known as babbling. They're just going to repeat a phoneme over and over again. So that might include things like ba, 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 ba. That might include things like ma, 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 ma. But over time, usually by about 8 to 10 months, babbling is going to include various intonations that sound very much like speech, and they are going to start combining different phonemes together to produce something that sounds very word-like without actually being word-like. Now, early babbling has some really interesting features as well. Oftentimes, this will include phonemes that they will never ever use in their native language. So for example, in the Japanese language, the R and L phoneme, there are not distinct R and L phonemes. They are used interchangeably. Here in the United States, R and L are distinctive phonemes with distinctive sounds. But Japanese infants will babble with an R phoneme or an L phoneme, and they can make distinctions based on hearing between the two. But over time, as we get input into our native language, we lose our ability to be able to distinguish between phonemes in languages that we don't speak. So we become a master of our own language, but that hurts our ability to distinguish between phonemes of other languages. Now, around a year old, infants will produce their first words. And most of the time, they're going to be things like mama, dada, bye-bye. Mine was bye-bye. And my question for you is this, because this really sounds an awful lot like babbling, doesn't it? So a question that I'd like you to think about, and this isn't something that necessarily has an easy answer, but I'd like you to think about it, is are those actual words? Or are parents just hearing what they want to hear? So something to think about for you. Now, regardless of whether they are what parents want to hear or not, one of the things that we are going to find is that the first words are typically going to be concrete, and they refer to present place and time. Generally, children are going to begin putting words together into 2-word utterances at about 1.5 to 2 years of age. The speech is going to be considered telegraphic, so it's going to sound a lot like old-timey speech that you would put in a telegram. So things like want cookie, no nap, ball now, kitty here. So you can see that it's major nouns and verbs. It doesn't really have a lot of function words or articles or things like that. Now, after reaching the 2 to 3 word stage, Utterances are suddenly going to explode, and they're going to be in a lot of different lengths, typically between 3 to 8 words. We don't really have anything beyond a 2-word stage, so we have a 1-word stage and we have a 2-word stage, but we don't really have a 3-word stage or a 4-word stage or a 5-word stage. Once you've gotten to the 2-word stage, you're eventually going to get to the point where you're combining multiple words into sentences, and utterances are going to be of different lengths at that point. If you can do at least 2 words, at some point you're going to be able to create sentences of many lengths. And this all happens even though children get very little feedback about their errors. And what's more, when children do get feedback about their errors, they tend to not use it very much. So I'm going to give you an example that was originally developed by McNeil in 1966. Children generally do not use feedback on verbal processing and on language. So a child goes, "Nobody don't like me." The mother goes, "No, say nobody likes me." The child goes, "Nobody don't like me." "No, say nobody likes me." The child goes, "Nobody don't like me." And then this goes on for 8 more times, which I have not printed for you here. And then the mother goes, "Now listen carefully. Say nobody likes me." The child goes, "Oh, nobody don't likes me." So you can see that children manage to learn language and speak at a very adult-like level relatively early on in their lives without getting a lot of feedback on mistakes. And even in the case of this mistake, at some point, this child will not be talking like this. So children notice language by noting regularities in the language. So it's almost like children and infants are little statisticians. So researchers have actually given young children long strings of sentences, and they're kind of made up in a nonsense language, but there are some regularities that tend to happen over and over. Certain syllables tend to occur together, certain letters tend to occur together, and certain boundaries tend to be apparent. If you get enough exposure to where those regularities are, it becomes a lot easier to figure out where the stream needs to be segmented. So children notice regularities in the language like they're little tiny statisticians. So one of the things that we find is that children start to notice that rules exist in language. So for example, if we want to make something plural, we add an S to form a regular plural. And generally, this is what we do. A dog, we have dogs. A cat, we have cats. A shirt, we have shirts. The problem is children learn this, but they don't understand that there's a difference between regular plurals and irregular plurals. So for example, we have a goose, we have many geese. We have a mouse, we have many mice. So children will learn that S's make plurals. They don't understand that irregular plurals do not work like this, and so they'll say things like feets or foots. Now here's what's really critical. Even though this looks really bad, it indicates that they're learning something, because no adult in their life would ever say feets or foots. And most adults won't. So it's clear that they're not learning this through imitation, but rather they're learning about a rule, they're over applying it, and they're making mistakes, but their errors are meaningful. They're learning something. Now, we find a similar thing that happens with regular and irregular verbs. So, for example, past tense, we have sing. Past tense is sang. Now, most of the time, you and I, for regular verbs, past tense, we add ed. I walk, I walked. But we know that not all verbs work like that. Like, I run, I ran. Now, what's interesting is that for irregular verbs like sing, children will initially use the correct tense. And it looks like they're getting it right. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they're going to start using singed. Or for run, they will start by saying, I ran, and then they'll go, I runned. I had one that was a little hard for me. I did, I write, and then I would say, yesterday I writ. So what happens is that we get these rules for regular verbs, but we're over applying them to irregular verbs. So in the case where they're using it correctly the first time, it's been suggested that that's happening because they're imitating. But then they learn that adding ed puts something in the past, and they apply it to everything. And then eventually they go back to saying, because now they understand that there's a difference between regular and irregular verbs. So I think I'm going to go ahead and stop here. And when we come back after spring, or I keep wanting to call it spring break, when we come back after Thanksgiving break, we will talk about the relationship between language and thought, and we'll talk about parsing, and we'll talk about pragmatics. And I will see you all next time. Bye.